On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Henry Hippely. He is the head of talent, and we're going to be talking to him about TA Playbooks. And what do I mean by that? Well, when you get hired, you typically are bringing in a bunch of tools that you have in the toolbox. And what do you actually use, and when do you use them, and how much of it do you carry through? And you got to make sure you understand the stakeholders, understand that change management, and more importantly, adoption. That's really why we do all this. And super excited to have Henry on to talk to us about this. Henry, thanks for joining the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I guess, the topic of playbooks are within every single industry. Everyone likes to leverage what they've done in the past, kind of leverage what's worked. And let's maybe talk about that. High level, when you think about the playbook that you've put together, and we can call it a playbook, but it could be an assortment of tools really that you've picked up through your experiences. As you're going through from job to job, do you ever really inventory and kind of look at that historical knowledge base? Do you document it? I guess how does your playbook look?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, because I've been at a number of different types of companies and sizes. So there's a lot of like companies that are pretty early stage, like Series A plus, and then there's some growth stage or public companies in there as well. And so, yeah, I think it's this, you have this compilation of like a lot of different things that have worked, things that haven't worked. And so I think mentally you just sort of like have this inventory of different things that you can implement or different levers that you can pull depending on the situation and the company. And so I think for the most part, you write some of that stuff down, but it's kind of more about pattern matching, kind of depending on the given situation that you're in at a time. And just, there's not, even if it's the same size of company and it's the same stage, like it's not the same thing's not always going to work, right? So it's just more about kind of like being able to pattern match, but do that loosely enough that you can adjust when necessary.
Absolutely, yeah. I guess it's interesting. I think every job that exists, we leverage this pattern matching to kind of leverage our previous work. The tricky part, and especially when it comes to maybe something like the talent side, where you are very much in service of the business. You're there to support the growth. And no two organizations are built the same, function the same. If you were an accountant, you carry a lot of tools, but there's rules and regulations. Engineering, lots of frameworks, but they're finite. But with talent, you literally could have things be distinct from every single org and the culture and all those things. When you do enter a new company, and you've been at some great organizations, when you do enter a company and you are going through the onboarding process and kind of absorbing that company's tribal knowledge, their culture, their processes, at what point do you start looking at your toolbox? What's that time span look like? How much time do you want to spend inventorying the company you're going to start working for versus starting to think about other things?
It varies. Like, I think you can get like a pretty good grasp on like what a company's got going on, like relatively quickly, especially earlier stage companies. It's just all very transparent, right? Like, because they want to throw you into the deep end as fast as possible. And so you're kind of forced to just like, for lack of a better term, drink from the fire hose and just kind of like assess the lay of the land. And every company is different, right? Like there might be similarities between two Series A companies, but like what they've done so far, who they've brought on, like the infrastructure that they have in place, like what's working, what's not working is going to vary company to company. And so you just have to be a little bit careful about being like, okay, I'm just going to come in and like, I have a hammer and everything's a nail. And like, we're going to make some sweeping changes. And so it's more about like meeting them where they are currently and being like, hey, let's inventory like what is working. Let's understand what's not working, and for the things that are not working, like what sort of changes can we make that maybe I've done before or that I've had success with that we can kind of introduce. But at the end of the day, it's like if you come in too heavy-handed, there's going to be consequences, and it's probably not going to work great. And so kind of being like, hey, I'm here to assess and kind of understand like how you've done things, and then like obviously you brought me in for a reason, so like we're going to make these changes or start to make some changes here and start to build trust that way as opposed to just coming in and trying to like, start from scratch.
So I guess, coming in, you mentioned not being heavy-handed, being thrown in the deep end. When you are coming in with experience, you have a knowledge base to pull from, then how do you start looking at what opportunities there are to help improve things in those deficiencies? Because obviously you're going to hit the ground running. You're going to be all of a sudden a million miles an hour. You're going to be running in every direction that you need to be running. And that assessment of, okay, I have seen the pattern matching you mentioned. Is there a time period, or is there a length of time, or from your experience, how much time do you observe before you start looking at patterns?
And it's a process, right? So like, I think you can jump in and start to have impact while you're still evaluating how things are going, right? Because like, especially earlier stage companies, I mean, even most companies, like they bring in recruiting leaders and recruiters to like hire people, right? So it's like you can work within the existing infrastructure and the existing way of that they're doing things to hire people like immediately, right? And that's the way that you're going to have the most impact, and that you're going to be able to like build trust with stakeholders like very quickly. That's an avenue I usually try to go, where I'm like, I'm going to come in and I'm going to hire people, or my team is going to try to hire people as fast as possible to build that trust, have an impact. But then we're going to be like, okay, let's see what's broken along the way. Because sometimes you don't like you'll get brought in, and leaders will say like, well, we need to fix this, this, and this. And then it's your job to evaluate, say, like, is that actually broken? Like, what's working, what's not working? And the best way to like pressure test that is to actually run the hiring process, right? So you can kind of see, like, is that actually broken? Are there other things that maybe are blind spots that you haven't seen that we do need to fix? And so, from my experience, just running the process, getting a lot of candidates through into the funnel, see what's actually working and not working is the best way to actually evaluate that, and then kind of go from there. But if you're sitting from like an ivory tower and just kind of being like, well, let's fix these things without actually testing it, it's not a recipe for success.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you're not going to at a startup have that opportunity to be in that ivory tower. I guess coming into a situation, as you kind of been outlined, you do have to kind of pressure test, get some process moving. When you are looking at that and you're trying to, again, you want to show value, you want to make sure that things are efficient. That balance of wanting to show value and, hey, you hired me because I'm good at my job, I'm here to make an impact. Is there danger of potentially trying to do too much too soon? Is there a danger of trying to show value by implementing change, or trying to come in and make something happen to show, hey, this is why you brought me in?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a lot of variables too, right? So it depends a lot on the stage of the company and kind of what they're looking for, right? So at a bigger company, it's just like it's more about the infrastructure. It's like, how do we make this a recruiting machine, right? How do we kind of make these little tweaks that can enable us to hire faster? Because they already have a lot of the infrastructure set up. At an earlier stage company, you're going to have a little bit more leeway to make broader sweeping changes a little bit faster. But I still think even at earlier stage companies, you have to build that like really strong platform of trust to be able to do that, right? Because if you're just coming in and saying like, we're just going to make these broad changes without actually proving or showing value, or kind of showing that you can hire, that you understand good talent, that you understand what's happening at the company, people are going to be much more resistant to that. And so I think it's more about like, building that layer of trust, kind of making sure everybody's on the same page, and then making small changes that then turn into big changes. And so there's, just kind of having almost creating a just sort of a schedule or of some sorts, where it's like, hey, here's what I see that's broken. Here's what I want to fix. And then kind of having be like, well, the first quarter, I'm going to do this, this, and this, or this is my plan. And then we're going to roll out this. And then we're going to test this, this, and this, and quarter by quarter. And then getting your stakeholders on board with that, where it's like, hey, here's my plan. Do you agree with this? Do you see things that maybe are missing? How do you feel about this? These are the end goals after we implement these things. Is a good way to do it. And so I'm somebody I just know this about myself. I'm like conflict adverse. Like I'm not somebody who's going to just come in and be like, we're doing it this way and this my way or the highway. I want consensus. I want buy-in, almost to a fault sometimes. And so, I want people to be on the same page and to be able to say like, yeah, that's a good plan. Like let's do that. And I'm actually pushing myself to do it faster and faster, because it's like, hey, like, sometimes you can, crack a few eggs along the way, and it's okay. But that's generally how I try to do it, where it's like slow at first, and then once you build the trust, you can do it more rapidly.
I mean, I like that. And I guess, you mentioned, you don't like that conflict. You like to get consensus. I think when it comes to adoption, I think that does help. I guess just maybe a question around that and how you kind of understood yourself, because I think sometimes people avoid conflict and they don't realize it, that they're not really engaged with that conversation, and they're withdrawing because they're trying to avoid it. They get others that are like, actually, I don't mind it at all, and they end up picking battles that they shouldn't. I guess for you personally, I mean, you've been doing this job for a bit of time. At what point do you actually recognize that? So, because I think it is important to recognize how you handle those situations. At what point did you kind of start picking up that that was something that was just part of your personality?
Yeah, some of it was on my own, but like I think a lot of it was just having really great leaders that I reported into who were, really good at check-ins and doing performance reviews and, kind of talking about like, hey, this isn't a problem, but here's an area of opportunity for you. And a lot of times that came through and just sort of just an awareness thing where it's like, hey, Henry, your emails are very passive. Like you write in a very passive tone. Like just be more direct. Like nobody, like people want direct language. You don't need to say like, hey, it'd be great, or like this would be nice, or that kind of stuff. It's just like be direct. I was like, oh, I didn't even realize I did that. And so oftentimes it was just somebody who you report to or somebody that you respect that's a mentor that's just sort of giving you the awareness that you're like, you actually do this, and this might hurt you in your career at this point or this point. So let's work on kind of being a little bit more, open to conflict or kind of having those direct conversations. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you get with it. So I'm trying to, realize those things more on my own, but I do think having leaders kind of point those things out has been really helpful for me. And then it's just something I try to keep top of mind and work on as I go.
Yeah, I guess when you look at that and you're looking at, when we kind of are talking about change management, and you're trying to make sure that people are following a particular process, obviously getting them to buy in, recognizing the value within the changes you're trying to make, that's highly important. Within that conversation, where do you start actually understanding the value of that change and explaining that to them? And the reason I'm asking is sometimes because we're very process heavy, the process might seem intuitive to us, but then getting a stakeholder to understand this is the real payoff is always not easy. How does that look like in your experience?
I can speak to this in the context of like working with engineering teams because that a lot of my experience is on the engineering side. And I love working with engineering teams because it's very black and white, right? Like they love following specific rules or specific ways of doing things. They love process. And if we say we're doing something a certain way, they follow that way pretty cleanly. So it's just they're always the first to kind of make the moves to build infrastructure, build rules around recruiting, which I love. And so I think when you're working with those types of stakeholders, right, like you have to have a really great relationship with the leader because, I can say things till I'm blue in the face, but the engineering team's not always going to respond to me the same way that they would respond to, a head of engineering or like a VP who's actually helping implement. So you need to have a really strong partnership there, and you need to make sure that you're on the same page as the leader. I think a great way to do that is through data and pulling data where you can. And so, again, engineers respond really well to just data in general and having data tell a specific story where it's like, hey, for example, we're having candidates or engineering candidates complete this take home test as a technical screen. But what we're seeing here is that like 50% of the candidates that get the take home test actually never turn it in and they just drop off, right? So clearly there's a problem there where, we need to have some sort of different technical evaluation where they don't feel like there's such a huge burden on them to complete some take-home test and drop out, whereas we could hire those people otherwise, right? So being able to show the story there with data where it's like here's the drop-off rate is pretty impactful. So I try to lean on data wherever I can and pass through rates and kind of telling a story that way because I think it's very clear and black and white. And then I think overall it's just sort of like, are we hiring great people, right? And sometimes data doesn't always tell the story, right? Especially when you kind of get to like offers, and it's like, well, we have a 60% offer rate. How do we get that to 75%, right? It's more about like, well, we need to evaluate those on a one-off basis because especially earlier stage, we're not going to have hundreds of offers that we're giving out, and so you need to be like, well, let's go through those one by one and just kind of understand the situation and what we could have done differently in each of those scenarios to potentially flip from a no to a yes. And so sometimes it is a little bit more manual and kind of like walking through that and kind of understanding like there's not always going to be data to tell a story, and that's okay. And we'll understand those situations. But then when there is enough data, let's lean on that as much as we can.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the data points are critical, and I guess you're working with engineering teams, you're working with people that are also coming in from other environments. They have opinions, they have seen different processes work. Obviously, you want to put a process in place which makes sense. When you do have, let's say, input into the process external from talent, and you're trying to incorporate that change, you're trying to take that in consideration, how much flexibility do you have? Because obviously you've seen this done multiple places. Most engineering leaders have seen hiring processes done in multiple places. It's a rare dynamic that you have two different people who are very well vested in the same outcome that might not both agree on the ideal process. I guess walk us through that bit of conflict or potential conflict, because that's a tricky one.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, there's small variance between like how different companies do interviewing, especially on the engineering side. There's kind of a general, so whenever you come into the situations, it's kind of more of like putting your cards on the table with an engineering leader, where it's like, well, this is where I came from, and this is kind of the process that I typically that I've seen success with. And then they kind of talk about how they've seen success and like what they've run in the past. But then beyond that, there's kind of the industry standard, where it's like this kind of objective thoughts from the industry, which are pretty well documented around like, well, what's a typical process look like? What are like good industry standards for pass-through rates from like on-site to offer or offer to accept, or like, what's the breakdown of source of hire? Like that indicates you have a healthy pipeline, right? And so I think it's more about like, well, let's start in the middle and look at the objective data, and then like let's see what we want to tweak or change to make this unique to our company. And I think that's a good starting point, where it's like, let's try to meet in the middle. If there's differences too, I think you can A/B test or A/B test this as well, where you're like, hey, we have this difference of opinion. I think we should do this technical screen. You think we should do this technical screen, or have these different stages. Why don't we just put candidates through two different funnels and like see what works, or what has the highest conversion, or what the feedback is from them, and determine what we want to do long term. So there's things like that, and of course, ensuring everybody gets a fair process is really important there. But there's a lot you can do there to kind of like get to consensus without having a ton of conflict.
Talent is a unique role because we work in service of other domain experts, which is always not the case. Because if I work in engineering, I'm an engineer. If I work in accounting, I'm an accountant. And if I'm working in marketing, I'm a marketing person. In talent, we're dealing with multiple different domain experts. I guess when you look at that aspect of the job and the fact that somebody does have that domain expertise, sometimes I know you mentioned data points. That's a little tricky, especially when you're trying to put a change in place and the other person says, well, I've done this job. I've been through this process myself as a candidate. That's a tricky one. That's,
Totally.
Yeah. How have you dealt with that in the past?
Yeah. I mean, especially when I initially went from like agency in-house, I had a ton of imposter syndrome around that specific area, especially on the engineering side, where it's just like, I don't know what you guys do every day. Like I have a general idea. I know how to code a little bit, but like, obviously, like you guys are the experts there. And I think something that's really important for talent to like kind of remember is that like they are the experts on the engineering side, of course, but like you are the expert on the talent side, right? And like you need both to have a successful hiring process. And there's a lot of stuff that you do on the talent side that you might disregard in your own head a little bit, but that is incredibly important for the entire process. And so it's just important to remember that it's a marriage of the two things, where it's like they wouldn't be able to hire en masse without you, and you wouldn't be able to hire great engineers without them. So you got to be in the middle and understand that both are equal and valuable to the overall process. And sometimes even today, I still remind myself of that, where it's like there's a ton of value that talent brings to the table, and they recognize that. And you have to kind of come with the confidence that you are bringing that value as well. So that's important. There are certain things where it's like technical evaluation, stuff like that, where it's like you sort of have to trust them, of course, because you can't spot test that. But and I think, if you have really great early engineers and you bring on great engineering leaders, like they'll set up kind of safeguards around that in terms of like shadowing, reverse shadowing, things like that, to ensure that it's like, hey, we're holding a consistent technical bar. And you can help implement those things. But at the end of the day, like they're going to have to be the ones that evaluate it, and you have to trust their evaluation.
I guess when you look at the role, and we've been talking about change management adoption, we've been talking about the TA Playbook, and obviously you've kind of outlined when and how some things have to happen, making sure you have consensus. When you think about this role and you think about how proactive you can be, how forward thinking you can be, because I think a lot of times a lot of talent activities might be reactive, where potentially dealing with some of those things, and some of it is proactive. To show that value, obviously, a hire is the clearest demonstrable. Yeah, you see, we got these people through the door. That's great, right? That's a big win. But outside of that, if you're trying to be more proactive, you want to show value. You obviously have all this experience. Where do you demonstrate that? Can you demonstrate that, and where do you demonstrate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Just because, to your point, like hires are the ultimate, currency in recruiting. But sometimes like you're given a slate of roles that are really difficult, and like maybe you don't see a lot of success from like an actual hire standpoint right away. So I mean, for me at least, I think it comes down to like the relationship that you build with hiring managers, and I try to encourage recruiters on our team to do this as much as possible. But it's really all about like, one, setting really clear expectations with your hiring partner about like what you're going to do. And it's less about like, oh, I'm going to make this hire by the end of the month. It's more about like, what can I commit to right away, where it's, you're going to see incremental activity, right? So that, to start, it could be like, I'm going to do X number of reach outs every single week, and at the end of the week I'm going to report back on how many reach outs I actually did. Or it's like, hey, I did these 5 recruiter screens this week. Here's how they went. Here's what I saw. And it's just kind of reporting back, and it's just over communicating. And I think some people are like, well, I'm going to annoy them because I'm giving them so much information. It's like, no, you're not. Like, they want to see that information. They want to see like what you're doing, because they're not seeing the hire yet. So it's like, let's see the work that's going into this along the way. And then getting feedback on that work, where it's like, hey, I reached out to these 50 people. Like, can you just go through a couple of the profiles and spot check and kind of make sure I'm on the right page? Or it's like, hey, I passed these 3 candidates to you that you screened. Let's walk through like what was the feedback? Like, what can we change in terms of like what we're looking for? Are we still on the right path? Things like that. So I think it's more about having just very, very clear expectations at different stages, like what you're accountable for, and then holding them accountable to things on their end too, where it's like, hey, we said that you're going to do 3 screens a week. I need you to make the time for those, or I need you to enter your feedback within 24 hours. Like, there's just these little things where it's like, it's just sort of a respect thing, where it's like, I'm putting my time into this and giving you these things that I promised. You need to do these things. And I think if you have that mutual respect, like it goes a really long way, and just, creates a true partnership between recruiting and a hiring leader, versus just being like, I'm giving you everything, and then you're sort of doing things on whatever schedule you want to do them, right? So the more you can create that type partnership, and clear expectations on both sides, I think the more successful you'll be, and the more trust you'll have.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's great insights. And as you've been kind of talking about a lot of these different aspects within the knowledge base you're bringing to the table, I guess maybe the final question for you is, when you are looking at adoption, you mentioned obviously being proactive, asking people to, contribute, follow the process essentially. That adoption piece, especially kind of we're alluding to finding that champion, finding someone that's like, hey, this is in my self-interest. I should do this as well. I need to have my team do this, or I need to have somebody else, looking at this the way I'm looking at it. That adoption piece, when you are trying to find that champion, who does the champion look like? Does it always have to be the engineering leader? Is it somebody in the team? Is it case by case?
Yeah, that's a fair point. Like, I think, yeah, oftentimes it is the leader, because you have to get their buy-in, where it's like, I need this, and this from you as a hiring leader, or else like this isn't. I don't want to say it's not worth my time, but it's something where it's like, I can spend my time with other leaders who are going to really commit to this. So it's like getting their buy-in is really important. I think going back to like the engineering side, like I think there's champions kind of all over the place, where it's like the engineer who really steps up to do more interviews in a week than they have to, but it's because we're at a breaking point from interviewer capacity and they're really stepping up. And then kind of highlighting that to the team where it's like, hey, Jake did these 5 screens this week. He was only supposed to do 2. Like, thank you so much. Like, we really appreciate you. Or like an engineering manager who's doing a lot of like packet reviews at the end of the process, just because they know it's valuable. And so I think you can find those champions kind of in different places, both as ICs and leaders, not necessarily the leader of the organization. I think it's more about just being like showing appreciation and highlighting those folks, and then having other people kind of see them as like aspirational kind of talent leaders within their organization who really help the process. Because it can be the leader of the org, but you need more people that are really kind of buying into what you're doing on the recruiting side for it to be truly successful. And so if you have these different kind of like champions throughout the org, it's just infinitely more successful, and can work out really well for the org.
Absolutely. I like the insight. I appreciate the time, the advice. I'm sure we haven't exhausted the topic. If somebody does want to reach out to you just to follow up with a question or something regarding the episode, what's a good way of contacting you?
Yeah, just LinkedIn's usually good. Just Henry Hippely. I work at Lumos, so you can find me there.
Awesome. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes. Again, Henry, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Amir. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right, that's the episode. We'll be back again to forget a different topic. Until then, 2 things. One, when we do talk about these playbooks and we talk about all that experience you carry in from job, I think Henry kind of outlined the process he follows when he does join, how to kind of look at the stakeholders, how to manage and understand those requirements, and make sure that the change actually gets adopted. I think that's really the key. And Henry had some great insights, and he shared some great stories of how he's seen things. So share this with somebody else. I think it would definitely help them out. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.